Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute, an Institute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This recording is episode 141 of A Conversation With. We are now in our 5th year of recording. I'm going to be speaking shortly with a gentleman from Australia, Wayne by name. And before I introduce some of the topics that Wayne and I are going to talk about imminently, I would like to tell you about one new feature on the website of our dear college. And you can find the link to ApocatastasisInstitute website down below in the description. We've been working very hard on our flagship website through the totality of 2022, but certainly this past summer. And we have a lot more goodies in store. The thing that I want to bring your attention to is the all-school calendar. This is a new feature that we have on the website, and it's just that. It is a notice of all of the events happening at the college day by day. That includes classes that we're conducting. So if you're enrolled in one of our courses, it's all there. It includes hours of the Divine Office from the Holy Liturgy, which is open to the public. It includes events with LCN. It includes the seminars, the lectures, the film screenings, and their subsequent discussions. It includes everything, including extraordinary events such as the celebration of the Transitus of St. Francis on the 4th of October, as well as the pilgrimage to the shrine in Lourdes next summer. So if you go to the all school calendar tab, you can see just that if you scroll down some, and here is just a little sampling from the guts of September. Now, if you go down just a little bit more, you can also get a PDF of our semester schedule with the classes and then some special events to notice, some NBs, some nota benes there as well, having to do with the calendar. So, you know, this is your college as well. Maybe you are enrolled. Maybe you're a staff member here. It's your college, but also you're just in the general public. You support our work. You're interested in the work. Well, we have programs for you as well. And so you can find all of that on the calendar there. We have a little Robinson Crusoe cartoon. All right. So now moving along here, Wayne Cristiano is the gentleman whom I will be imminently speaking to. If you are on YouTube, you will have to go to the description below for the BitChute link. I don't put too much, if any, original content on YouTube. What original content goes up doesn't stay there very long, let's just put it that way. So head on over to BitChute down below and you can see the conversation. If you're watching this on that website, just keep watching and we'll momentarily merge with the conversation with Wayne. But Wayne teaches at Charles Darwin University in Australia. And we're going to be talking about what I would phrase as the weaponization of sexuality, particularly among sexual minority groups by elements of state power. And in particular, we're going to be looking at Wayne's essay on drag queens and dragons, which appraises the militarization, the co-option, however you like, of the different advocacies for sexual minorities by, as I say, large state combinations. For example, the US State Department, dripping from blood from head to foot, also flies the rainbow flag every year. What on earth is going on in Foggy Bottom? Well, Wayne is going to speak about that, and this happens to be the illustration for the Apostles publication of Wayne's essay. And we all know that Dr. Nirmal Das, the editor of the Apostle, is also on the staff of ApocatastasisInstitute as our bursar. So it's great to have access to the wide array of scholars, authors, and commentators that appear regularly on the Apostle. So thank you for watching this episode 141 with Wayne. If you're on YouTube, click on the link. Otherwise, here we go. All right, Wayne, welcome to this episode 141 of A Conversation With. How are you doing?
Thank you very well, John. Lovely to finally meet you. And thank you very much for inviting me onto your show.
For sure, for sure. Now, Wayne and I, to the audience, are going to be talking predominantly about Wayne's article, well entitled Of Drag Queens and Dragons. And we have a lot to get into there. But before we get into that more serious analysis of social, political interaction and manipulation and such, and your very wide-ranging essay, Wayne, tell us a bit about yourself outside of the immediate piece here. What are some of your interests, your professional background, and this sort of thing?
Okay, so I did an undergraduate degree and then a master's. My master's was on Nietzsche and Plato. I then did a PhD on Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And I was not in Australia at that time. Philosophy was exclusively, and I really mean exclusively, except for maybe one or two departments or minor sections of departments in some universities, but where I was in Australia, but where I was, if you wanted to know the philosophical tradition, you couldn't do it in a philosophy department. So I was very much a self autodidact, I suppose, in philosophy. I learned some Greek, as I said, and then I learned German. I went off to Freiburg during the early-ish 80s, where, because I had a PhD scholarship at the University of Adelaide after my master's on Nietzsche and Plato, as I said. So the next project which was really about an apprenticeship, I just wanted to really school myself in the history of modern philosophy. And so it was on Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And I had to read a number of figures in between. And it's funny, my last book, which is called Idolizing the Idea, A Critical History of Modern Philosophy, in many ways is the sort of, I don't know, 40, 45-year journey that completes that project. So in some ways, I think, there's an interesting thing that I found is I think some ways your life is anticipated before you live it, and you have a smell for it, a sense of it. You don't quite know where it's going, and you mess up and go along all sorts of paths, but then at some point you realize this is what I had to do. So I did that, and then I got an academic job, and it was in a politics department. Ironically, the people that appointed me, I think, regretted it within a couple of years, because the department was in civil war and I was on the wrong side of that, and all of us eventually left. And I jumped ship to European studies, because although at that time I was in a political science department, I had been interested almost exclusively in philosophy. And then, due to personal circumstances in my life, I came to have and reading a guy called Eugen Rosenstock Hussey, I came to really question the value of the philosophical tradition. So in some ways, what's come out of that is eventually, when I did get back to writing more philosophical works after a break of about 5 or 6 years, that break was informed by my own existential take on things, and then an interest in history and reading history. So a combination of trying to understand human character what are we doing, and how do we assemble our information? And then I realized, well, the problem with philosophy is it helps you organize information, but it doesn't provide information. And that's life does that. Life gives you the information. So I became, I suppose, even when I had read Nietzsche, that had attuned me to being somewhat skeptical of too much faith in reason. Not because I'm an anti-reason. I think just reason will always collapse under the burden of too many expectations, and it becomes supplanted basically by, I think, inferences and more uncharitably hot air, and that's the danger. So I then moved to European intellectual history almost completely in terms of my teaching. And then I went to the University of Hong Kong, where I taught European studies, and then I had to do that. To take up that job, I also had to do stuff on the European Union, which was the most tedious part of my intellectual life. And then because of the university policy in Hong Kong, which was, you know, a great place and so interesting to be in and very charitable in terms of their salaries and everything. And at that stage, less managerialistically suffocating than what had been taking place in Australia. I came back to Australia to a tin pot university, and I saw everything's changed, but at least I was able to teach exactly what I wanted until right at the end, where I got dragooned into marking some dreadful stuff, which said I had to get out of the place. But by then I'd written a number of books that were important to me. Possibly the most important was one called Power, Love and Evil, in terms of that was the book that subtitle being Contribution to a Philosophy of the Damaged, which was really about how we break each other and how in our brokenness we are able to see things. And so in some ways that's the antithesis of the philosophical idea that you just collect more and more knowledge and wisdom will come from that. Mine was, and that I think led me to a certain take upon what I think are the existential truths conveyed by the Christian tradition, because I think they come out of that experience of the recognition of error, sin, evil, original sin. These things I think all, for me, adequately better encapsulate how I see what is going on in the world around me than straight out philosophical language. Not the least being being that philosophers tend to focus upon how to avoid the problem, whereas life is lived fixing up problems, and the problems of past generations, the problems of your own life, the problems of your encounters, etc. You know, as well as trying to get things right. But so that and the person accompanying me intellectually through a lot of my journey from about the age of 30 something, early 30s, was a guy called Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who I've written a lot upon, and I ended up writing a very large book with University of Toronto Press. Unfortunately, they took it. It's the only university press that's been deigned to take any of my writing. But that was on Franz Rosenzweig and Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, and they had written an enthralling dialogue about Judaism and Christianity. And the very interesting thing about that, I took out of that is, apart from lots of stuff in the book, it's a very long book, was that at the end of the First World War, there was a very different response by the generation that came out of that than at the end of the Second World War. And in some ways, everything we're going to talk about later is due to the fact that the generation that came out of the Second World War were able to portray things in very stark oppositional terms, which overly simplified the problems that confronted us. And in many ways, it was a matchup to the 1848 generation and a picking up that 1848 generation, which was a very anti-institutionalist generation. But in the case of the 60s, that anti-institutionalism ultimately just meant to an institutional capture and reconfiguration. But the thing about both of those generations, of course, is that They're very young and very inexperienced people. Whereas a lot that are writing at the end of the First World War tend to have lived through it, even fought in that war. If you take someone like Adorno, for example, or Walter Benjamin, you know, they didn't fight in that war. They existed outside of that war. Benjamin, of course, dies because of committing suicide, you know, caught up in south of France and wanting to escape and being, you know, frightened and everything. But that, to me, the choice was very stark about where the evil came from, what was evil, etc. You know, the narratives around it. Evil, I think it's very complex, but it's very multi-factored. And young people like simple answers, in my experience of young people. And that's why they climbing on board all the stuff that I'm writing against in the postal. So yes, I just wanted to say that about the youthfulness, that whereas the first, I've just finished this thought off, that that generation that came out of the First World War, there was a reason why they were very theologically immersed after that war. They tended to take the tropes and metaphors and metonyms that come from religion far more seriously, because they, you know, the basis of the First World War is who's to blame, and the answer is very simple: pretty well everybody. You know, everyone going into it. Some people say it's the Germans, sir. You know, it's the German. That's what. But I think that's very naive, and it's a result. And this is, I think, the great thing about Eugen Rosenstock-Huessie's work out of Revolution. He does a massive analysis of ultimately the currents that feed into the First World War and how they're bound up with the various revolutions in the West. He ends up being much more optimistic than I am at that stage anyway. And I think I will make a criticism about him, because I don't want to just come across as of him, even I don't want to just be a disciple, even though he's my greatest teacher. And that is, I do think he underemphasizes the importance of elites and the character of elites. And that work, which I wrote a short piece on, well, relatively short, on Gaetano Mosca, I think he's very good. So the supplement of structural stuff, Mosca and elites, cultural stuff, Eugen Rosenstock-Huessie, existential stuff, my own experiences, they really inform the way I see things. And if anyone reads my essays in the postal, I hope they get a sense of those different aspects. And I'm far more interested than when I used to teach. I used not to talk much about contemporary politics at all. But I now realize, and I don't think, I've never believed that you should use the lecture hall for anything other than trying to encourage students to think. And I do think I achieved that. So you're not there to preach. But I do think, although probably as far back as almost 20 years ago, I started to be very suspicious, started to think about the ruling class and how it had been dominated by the generation of the 60s. I don't think it was until much more recent times that I came to think it's over. It's by the time you see it. And I remember when I wrote Power, Love and Evil, I said at one point, often when people see evil, it's too late to stop it. It's done. It's there. It's now you've got to deal. You just have to deal with it. If you successfully staved off evil, you don't see it. So there you go. They're my preoccupations, and my writings reflect those themes. And as I said in the postal, I tend to try and integrate that with what I see as the elite's destructive folly, because as I say, they will destroy them. They're gone. They're finished too. But they're going to have a short moment in the whatever sun it is, but you know, in the bonfire. They will have that moment. They're having that moment, but it's not. There's no way it can last. No way.
Yeah, it's very often the case by the time you get to externals that you can see something, whether that's personal or social, that's the caboose, so to speak. That's the
Yeah,
end of a much
yeah.
larger phenomena. And I've certainly had the same appraisal of things over the past few years, that this thing, let's say, um, this agenda is unnaturally speaking, and probably within our lifetimes is unstoppable, which, by the way, to the audience, doesn't mean that gives us any excuse whatsoever to stop resistance.
Yeah,
And
keep fighting, kicking and screaming
that's
into the
right.
fire.
You know, like they're running over you with the tanks, you'll be biting the tracks, like David Koresh said, and he'd know about Last Stands. But um so how would you define, as we move towards your essay there, Wayne, of Drag Queens and Dragons, for the audience, that will be linked in the description once again. Please read that. Please stop watching for the moment and read that first before proceeding. How would you define the ruling class? I very often have glommed onto the idea by a political philosopher here of the cathedral, that the ruling class is this
Oh yeah,
amalgamation.
next to this
Yeah, okay,
Mulberg.
you know there. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, yeah. I've read a lot of him. I can't. Maybe you can explain to me, perhaps after, exactly his point. But he certainly says little bits that I really like, and then he says other things I'm just completely flummoxed by. Where are you going with this? So
Right.
you might. I've only read about 600 pages of his. So usually after that, and I have spent my lifetime reading people like Hegel and Kant. So
No, it can be thick sometimes, and sometimes a little bit obscure, but at least the idea for him of the cathedral, of being
oh,
more,
yeah, that's great. Yeah,
yeah, being
You
more
might
than,
explain it to your audience. Yeah.
yes, so more than just kind of this normie thing that's presented to us, of power being simply civil force, let's say, or legal force, or the violence attached there too, but also probably more importantly than the civil structure, what makes the elite is also almost like a Venn diagram of media power, including films and things like that, not just broadcast news. And then, as you know, as you indicated a few times, Wayne, in your own experience, academe and the narrative there, let's say. And so that amalgam forms the cathedral. That's what I think. That's what Mencius Mollberg thinks the ruling class is. But what do you think, Wayne? How would you define that as we move towards your?
I think the cathedral is a very good. He also, if I believe correctly, he also came up with the red pill formulation, which is an interesting one that's had a life as well. So my amusement about where he's going is not on certain things, as I said, which I think he's to call it cathedral is pretty good. That's a good name, I think. So what's happening is, I do think using the term elite. I really quibble over this with myself, or struggle with myself, because I do use the term in two distinct ways, and I talk about elite and elite enablers, and sometimes the enablers I also include within the elite. So it's pretty, a kindergarten teacher that is going out there wanting to get the kids to, explore their sexuality, who's on, not that much money, is an elite enabler, and she's part of, or he's part of, or it's part of, or they are, whatever pronoun you want to call them, are part of an institutional configuration and social configuration in which status, opportunity, and power have been directly related to narration and task. Now, the narration and task, they're really just getting crumbs, and that's the true of most academics. They're pretty good crumbs, to be fair. It's not a bad job if you've got tenure, and if you believe that shit and you don't mind the meetings, and you're an administrator, wow, you can climb up that greasy pole, and you you know, you can teach your favorite subject, which seems now to be, you know, how to have sex with who you want sex with, which seems to be everywhere, or how to be, you know, how terrible your class, if you're white, how terrible everybody in your group have been, except you and your mates. And if you're black, well, just, you know, you don't become a Candace Owen, you don't become someone who's, or Thomas Sowell, you know, someone who actually thinks about things. You become someone who denounces things. So there's, you know, that's why, what's his name, Rene Girard, the mimetic desire stuff, it's part of what's the glue of this particular ruling class, because of the narrative. You know, other ruling classes have not been glued together or formed out of ideational alignments. That hasn't been necessary. But that is the way it works now. But the real elite, of course, are the people like Bill Gates, you know, those people that make squillions out of this, who, and in part they're doing it for the money. But there is a point in which, is it for the money? If I think about the Clintons, for example, you know, do the Clintons do it for the cash, Clinton Cash, you know, Peter Schweitzer's book, or do they do it because they're so sure that they know how to fix the world up? They need the cash to help them do that. And there is that. So there is a point in which they do feed into each other. But there's an underlying on the one conceit, but there's also, here's a word that's used all the time by these people, entitlement, sense of entitlement. If you speak a certain way, if you break down this world a certain way, if you go to a brand name college, or even if it's not a brand name college, you go anywhere and you come out with a degree in which, you know, everybody else except you and your mates are sexist and racist and transphobicist and blah blah, is, you know, that you don't know much else, but you know where you can apply this, and everything you look at you can parse in terms of this, which is very, you know, you can learn that in the week. In fact, nowadays you know it before you've even gone to university. You picked it up at school, you probably learned at grade 5 or 6, and if your parents believe this shite, you know, because it seems to explain everything. You know, but then you come out with the expectation, look, I know this, I've got to go and find people that don't know this, and I've got to teach them, and I've got to fix up the society, and I've got to stop the footballers from ever saying something like this, or the cricketers from saying something like this. I've got to get them to bend on a knee, or the baseball player, you know, everybody has to, because that's your expectation, is that everybody, that first of all, that when you speak with authority, and when you speak, others who don't agree with you should obey you, you know, so you need to fix them. This is the most, in a sense, it's the most insidious historical development of the downside of the Reformation. You know, it's the insidious development, every man a priest, you know, so, but every woman, every breathing thing, a priest, from the, you know, no matter where that's what you are, a priest or a priestess. And that's what, and plus the other thing, of course, in the Calvinist world is the public confession and observation and transparency. You know, that bore Habermas used to go, oh God, I can't stand him, but you know, on and on about, what is it? What's that term they're using? It basically means a transparent society, you know. What's the open? Oh, this happens to me sometimes. I get flooded with ideas. He's talking about, look, let's just say a society in which there's a public space, and public visibility. So he takes, of course, the Kantian principle of publicity, which is, you can't use that in international, that should be the basis of international relations. So we should all be, you know, out there and transparent, and that's where but of course it's very easy to be transparent if there's nothing there. if your identity is simply not even you don't have a character. Notice in literary departments, they don't study character. There's no such thing as character. It doesn't exist. It's simply an identity and power. This too is part of, so there's a whole confluence of ideas and behaviors and institutional configurations, which in the aftermath, I think, of the Second World War, a young generation now all flooding into the universities because the society has mistakenly, and this is its tragic mistake in the West, thinking that the only way that the society could reproduce itself was to train professionals within these spaces rather than have them in the workplace. And managers, that's how managers are part of this, the cathedral now too. They're another very important class, part of the cathedral. With all that happening, the only way to deal with that is you simplify everything. You make it, I wrote a long piece called The Dialectic of Imbecility. You basically make a compliant imbecilic society that have to be trained to be imbeciles, because if you're out farming or working or trying to make a living, you can't afford to be an imbecile. If you're raising a family the old-fashioned way, you can't afford to be an imbecile. You have a role to play. You can't afford to be as fluid, anything. You can't be everything. You can't be, you're not the Superman, you know, which is what all this elite is. It's they use the Marxian language to do a Nietzschean project. That is, they elevate themselves. They are the elite, but the card of entry is you have to be conformist enough, compliant enough to the narrative that authorizes their authority, their privilege, entitlement.
Yes, and
Oh, yeah.
that's quite a lot to think about. Thank you for that, Wayne. And I like how you included the managerial class. And I think over the past few years, we've seen how that mouse can roar when it's told to roar. So to speak.
It's been happening a long time. The piece that I didn't complete, and I've mentioned it to Nirmal, and he said you must complete it sometime. But I was going to do one more section of the dialectic of imbecility, but I just got distracted, which is I always say I'm going to do that, and then I do something else. So I should never say what I'm going to do till it's done. But I was going to write a piece about managerialism as part of this process. And the point I wanted to make there is that I think that Margaret Thatcher is it lays down the template of the managerialist state. And I think the commonplace reading of Margaret Thatcher as by conservatives, I don't particularly consider myself conservative or not. A very good friend of mine who runs a journal with me, and we argue once a week, and I love it dearly. So this is the journal, The European Legacy. I'm co-editor of that. So we publish 99% of authors would hate what I think and would probably, you know, try and get Edna to sack me if they knew what I really think, if they ever came across the posture. But Edna said to me, I think you're an what's the word? Antinomian, that's the word I'm looking for, isn't it? You know, against laws, you know, that's and I think yeah, that's pretty well true without being, you know, anarchism is not as serious because you need states, you need markets, you need all this, but veneration of authority is something that doesn't come natural to me, and veneration of stupid ideas is something I really don't like. I really love discussion. If someone shows me, oh no, what about this? But if they just go, oh, you're a white racist, I go, you know.
Well, as someone from
no, you're not. You're just an idiot, you know. If someone's, if that's their fallback, or you're a homophobe or a transphobe, that's your fallback. You're not.
As someone from Connecticut here in New England in America, yes, we're very, very familiar with the idea of the antinomian. It was a big controversy here back in the day.
Yeah, antinomian. Yes, I should have.
Absolutely. All right. So before we get too long in the tooth here, can you tell us, Wayne, how would you encapsulate your article there of drag queens and dragons? What would be the thesis that you present?
Okay, I'd say there's two bits. One is two elites in contest, one of which doesn't realize it's in contestation. That's the Western elite really thinks that it's there for everybody and it's globally there. And the only problem is that 3/4 of the world think that they're full of shit, you know. And other elites, like those in Central Europe, you know, which is Russia, even though they're hardly allied, but in some ways their mores are far closer. China, India, Africa, much of South America. South America's got another thing going on with its leftist political stuff, and then the, you know, reaction against that. But overall, in terms of the more traditional values and virtues, China now has become the leading hegemon of opposition. And now this also, the second part is, so two elites in contestation. The second thing I bring out in this is that they are also, that the one way of looking at the two elites is to look at the cultural revolutions which occurred in the more or less simultaneously, but for quite different reasons, but both involved the politicization of youth. One was much more orchestrated from above. And yet, as I say that, I have to say that Yuri Bezmenov, I've mentioned him in another of articles in the Postal. There's a YouTube lecture he gave in the 1980s where he talks about the Soviet strategy of winning the Cold War by indoctrinating the youth. And I think he's right. I think that's true. And the point he made then was, so this is in 83 or 84, he gives this interview. And the point he makes then is, this has been going on for about 20 years. So it's more or less a generation. And it will take at least another generation to undo it if you start now, and they never started now. So what we're seeing now is a generational buildup, which is why the institutions are so gone. And of course, the Marxists, like Gramsci, the obvious one, in a different way, Adorno and that crowd, they also, you know, they overturned Marx by saying, no, it's culture first. You have to open it up through culture, which were very smart. But of course, what they didn't get was, even were they right, and I think the problem was always that there's no economic answer there, because it's built upon the delusion that the people will spontaneously cooperate to be very productive. I just think, why would you ever believe that? They never have been, never will. Why would they all of a sudden do it? People have either reacted through economic advantage or survival. That's basically, or force. But survival is also force, you know. You have to do what someone tells you if you want to live. So what I'm bringing out in the essay, just to come back to it, is that the Cultural Revolution in the West, which suited the ambitious youth of the professional classes, who they all go to university, you know, the universities are open, and they all know the answer to everything is capitalism. Everything is wrong because of capitalism. What caused World War II? Capitalism. You know, these are smart guys. It wasn't just that silly ideology of the Nazis, and it was capitalism. And on they go. Now, in the 1980s, you know, there was a big new right, capitalism is good response. And, you know, serious people don't think like that, in my opinion. It's not, they don't think it's this or that, but they do recognize that each institution has come into existence because of certain things and certain problems and faced by a generation, but the ability of a generation to create a future is partly dependent upon the institution's inherits, how it then deals with those institutions, or if it creates new institutions. Now, I don't think that this generation that comes out of the Cultural Revolution has been creative institutionally. It's been creative aesthetically and artistically, and some of those creativity I really like. I like the Beatles and the, well, other bands more than them, but whatever. I like the Who and the Kinks, and, you know, I like that side of creativity. I think that's youthful, spontaneous creativity. And it tied into markets, and, you know, and the states in the Soviet Union and, you know, Eastern Europe, they feared that, and rightly so. But the second rate, the less creative, the dummies, as it were, or the, let's just say, you know, but the little know-alls thought they knew everything because they had read a handful of books. You know, they read Marx, they read Freud. And that's what, and the Cultural Revolution was them saying, no, look, sorry, everybody, you've got it wrong. Look, we love sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it's not whether sex, drug, for me, it's not, oh, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you know, we should, so evil. It's not that. It's, well, you are a generation that, is this just self-indulgent and infantilism that is talking? But in terms of world building, there's a reason why societies have been so suspicious of the sexual energy just being completely unleashed, and those that haven't have paid the price. But even those that, you know, very often, what was happening in the 1960s, of course, and it goes back a bit earlier to people like Margaret Mead, Freud himself. This is all very well discussed to some extent, and some aspects of it more than others, by E. Michael Jones in his Libido Dominati, a very, very good book. Which
a former guest on the show, in fact.
Oh, well, yeah, he's very interesting. He's a very interesting guy. It'd be interesting to have a discussion with him. But anyway, I think he's absolutely onto something there. And the way and how he takes that back to the Illuminati, that's really interesting in a way that's not the typical conspiracy theory, you know, but taking seriously secret societies, what they've observed about human beings, what they're trying to do, then where it's coming from completely elsewhere. That's all very interesting stuff. Where was I? Yeah, so this Cultural Revolution is one in which youth and the concerns of youth, what young man doesn't want to have as much sex as they possibly can, you know, you know, unless they're exceptional, but, you know, they do. And now it's happening, and the skirts are short, and the girls are gorgeous, and, you know, it's available. And of course, it doesn't, they're all miserable after a while, because life is not an act like that, and that act can have very severe consequences. And that's what I wanted to say earlier is, you know, they thought people like Margaret Mead were fantasizing, or others earlier had fantasized about, you know, sex for the Greeks and sex for the Romans, and it was just nonsense. It was just, you know, largely nonsense. Yes, there was a homoerotic culture, but the protocols around it in ancient Greece. What's his name? Bruce someone has written on this. He is I think, quite a conservative writer. It's not Bruce Bauer. You might know him, Bruce. Anyway, if you think of his name. And he's absolutely right about this. And the penalties for adultery in various times in Rome were very severe. So what happens, of course, though, is an elite generation, when they adopt it and embrace it, it creates a certain because they have opportunities, you know. And just think of the difference between being a single mother in a white, color may not be the main thing, but the way it's played out, it has been a symptom. But if you're a middle class woman who has a child, and you have all this support structure around you, and you have a loving family, which you've done nothing to do, really. They've made you, and you're the beneficiary of their making, and you are able to then get a career, which is other changes. Yeah, I mean, the kids might end up pretty screwed up. You think of people like Billy Corgan and Kurt Cobain. They hated the sexual stuff that was going on with their parents' generation, and the bitterness of the music at that time. That's tended to get lost. People, I think, have forgotten that. And now, of course, the sexualization of children make this all seem so normal, and mummy and daddy and this and that, and you know, my pee and my, you know, my little thing, and I don't want that one, I want what you got, and vice versa. These are the concerns that I'm, you know, have, because ultimately that cultural revolution, which was, you know, what a glorious time to be alive, blah blah blah, also had a downside. If we talked about the Beatles or the Love, look at the Velvet Underground, you know, and then even by the 80s and 90s, it all comes out in the music, you know, the sort of metal and all this stuff. It's incredibly violent and destructive, or even just the punk movement, the sneer, you know, all of this is a recognition that this was bullshit. That's what that's why I like that stuff. It's energistic, going, this is bullshit, even if the people doing it are so confused that they're not able to catch up with what came out of them. You know, the conscious mind, like Johnny Rotten's unconscious, is far more interesting than when he would speak consciously. But his unconscious, what was coming out, was really episodes of the real, and interesting. I think he's got a bit more interesting in his conscious mind as he's looked around more and seen, you know, what life is like around him with a bit more, which of course is why he's a bit more on the outer with that kind of elite than he used to be. So this is happening in the West. You know, it's immediate, it's infantile. You've got this young know-all generation. They move into positions of prestige and power, and that's what they got. You know, that's what they know. In China, the Cultural Revolution is there, orchestrated by Mrs. Mao and her husband to get back the power that had ebbed away from them because the Communist Party wanted to survive after the disaster of his stupid writings and stupid direction in the Great Leap Forward, you know. And it wasn't just stupid, it was diabolical. It was, the intention was, Mao had any idea that he cared about the suffering masses, when this is a guy that said half our population can go, so what? I knew a guy at Hong Kong Uni.
One of the crazier statements in a crazy century, probably the craziest.
So that revolution stops, you know, it stops. Mao gets pulled in the line. He's allowed to go and get his driver to cruise for the young girls to sit on his face, you know, all this stuff that came out in that doctor's book. And, you know, that's what he was. He was an emperor. He was allowed to be a figurehead. The Chinese Communist Party, pretty smart, realizing, God, we built our whole authority on these guys, Marx, you know, these guys with the beards, and then we got, you know, Mao clean shaven, but a real monster. But hell, we can't, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then, of course, you know, the decision is made. So in the first instance, they are able to regroup. The Cultural Revolution has stopped. The Cultural Revolution is also, it's Madame Mao and Mao orchestrating the young to go and push their parents out windows, teachers to wear dunces caps, go running around, you know, waving the books, screaming and yelling at each other. They know everything too. And then the adults come back in and go, hang on, stop it. And they, first of all, you know, Mao, and then Madame Mao shut up till she eventually goes to prison and kills herself. What a wretched, horrific creature, you know, the idea that, you know, when such creatures are the guiding forces of any kind of movement, you just know you're going to hell. So the Chinese have just put all that to bed. They're not doing anything like that. They've brought markets back in. They are corporatist in the same way the West is corporatist. All that stuff about capitalism. It's like Jerry Rubin. Remember Jerry Rubin and the hippie movement? You know, famous yippee, people should die before they're 30. What's he end up in the stock market in the 80s, you know? He's just because the opportunity's open. They take over, they have the expectation, now they're breeding the kids, but you know, these kids want a Yale degree. They want the brand name. They want the good jobs. And of course, they've got it now with corporatism, because it's not about these, you know, people in business don't give a stuff about capitalism or free markets. They care about their position in a market and their ability to make money. And if that means being a beneficiary or, you know, contractee of the state, great. If it means swinging the laws to protect them, great. That's what it is. It's a dog-eat-dog world. As I said, I don't believe this. The problem with the Marxists for me is, you've only got, if you want to stop that, you've got the state. There's nothing else big enough to do it. And the state has another set of problems. What we've done is create a corporatist entity. Sean Gabb, this very good classicist whose podcast I mentioned to you previously, and has written a couple of books, political books, which I think are very good. And his historical lectures, do yourself a favor, are fantastic. He says that he sees, you know, a critical problem within capitalism is limited liability, and rolling that back would be a very healthy way to get markets to be a bit more open. And I agree with that. He considers himself a libertarian. I tend not to like any label, but I think he's absolutely right about that, because the way, but this requires a culture. It requires an educated elite, you know, following the Frankfurt School and people like Gramsci, what's it, Breitbart, Andrew Breitbart used to say, politics is downstream from culture. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think possibly people like you and me hope that if the educational outlets, communicative platforms, which was really, YouTube had been a part of that, and now of course it realizes that's too dangerous, because there's more people think like us actually than don't. The elite is a smaller group. It's a pretty, as far as elites go, and I'm going to say elite and the enablers and, you know, the BlackRock people and Zuckerberg and Gates, in some sense, they're all in the same. They're in the same narrational camps. They are working for the same ends. And the people that say they're working to overthrow capitalism, of which my university life is always full of people like that, are full of shit, because they're not. They can say what they're doing. They might think they want that, but they're not. The first opportunity they get to have a buck, and they need resources. They want to go to the conferences. They want that, you know, they're first at the table. I'm the teacher. Give me. Who can take them seriously? Anyway, so the Chinese Communist Party don't take that seriously in that sense. They are first at the table, but they're not going to have their kids overthrow them. They're not going to have their kids destroy the family. They're not going back to what they had. So that's my. I'm sorry, I've segued hither and thither.
No, this was very good. I kind of like the long circle around myself. So we can attack or approach rather this idea of the ruling class and certain dynamics. And there's a few ideas I've jangling around my head, but the one that I'd like to get to first here, pertinent to your article, the Western elites. You mentioned certain notorious figures, individuals, and these corporations and such like BlackRock. This ball of wax, this cathedral, whatever. One of the things, Wayne, that I cannot crack it. I cannot crack why this would be the weaponization or the incorporation of, you know, various sexual minorities clearly as a tool of statecraft. It just happened that the previous show to this, I happened to be speaking to one of the guests was from Australia. And And, I had brought this up too. The United States Department, the State Department in this country, um, which is dripping with blood, which is extremely cynical, will also fly homosexual flags all across its embassies.
Yeah,
What
I know. I've seen their ads and everything.
this
Okay, I think there is an answer for that. To me, it's not a mystery. So it's the way in which the elite and enablers form the cathedral, if you like. One, the Bill Gateses and Sorosers and people like that. Remember me saying money, politics, conceit politics. For a long time, these people have believed, and in part it is because there is a power gap or there's a vacuum, and human beings abhor a vacuum when they can think they can have the intelligence and authority and power to fill it of resource use. So one of the things is that the wealthiest, who think they're the most informed, the brightest, they think they're the brightest, believe that they have to have population control, and that the way in which you'll get population control is to prohibit natural birth. I think this is the end game, is a prohibition of natural birth, which is, I'm not saying, I think there's a very small group of people who think this, and please, this is not happening because of simply top down, we say it, you do it. It doesn't work that way. It is certain circumstances are created in which there is an end game. It's a bit like the way the EU work. The EU always know where they're going. They just wait for the moment. If it's not working a day, they'll wait to tomorrow. But of course, it could all collapse, which is what I actually think will happen with this. But the alternative, the Chinese elite, it's not that I love them so much. I don't, because in some ways they will do some similar things, certainly. But I don't think it'll be anywhere near as anti-nature as what's happening in the West. So I think a social credit system, which has become de facto, is moving towards that, is their population control, which has been, that idea has been out there by various groups purporting to speak on behalf of humankind for a long time. Is that, where is it? I mentioned it in the article. I think it's in this article. I mentioned it. Where were those rocks where obelisks, where the optimum
Georgia
population,
Guidestones?
yeah. 500 should be 500 million. I think it was 500 million. Well, now I think it's 1.5 billion, but it's out there. They say it, the Klaus Schwabs of the world, the Great Reset. You just have to read UN documents, and this is not people in a back room. They are in back. Look, politics is always people conspiring, but these are people with terrific power and authority who have a strategy to try and implement their will. So that's over here. Now, the various sexual minorities, they're not thinking that or care about that. They have their interest, but their interest is in a world that reflects what they believe are their needs. And this is what I think is, this is because I think the need issue required certain changes in legislation, which were done 40 or 50 years ago. And I have no objection to that. But I think what's happened is in the politicization of that, and the reason various politicized groups also get funded and also get support in pushing through their certain legislative changes so that it's no longer just something tolerated, it has to be normalized. And it's very easy to convince someone is, look, if this is the biggest thing about you, your identity, see, that's, for me, that's the first, what sensible person thinks the biggest thing about them is who they have sex with? In my opinion, and I think there's a lot of gay people that think like this, and there's trans people who think like this. It's not about, it's the people that think that are people that there's nothing, what else is there? That's their most important thing.
What
And
role? Go on.
sorry.
I was just
No, I just wanted to say that the sexuality is because everything else in a sense of personhood is taken away. You're not a person. You're an identity, and it is an identity which you yourself willingly embrace, because here's the other thing, is where pleasure fits in the whole schema of our value systems of the post-60s revolt, as opposed to all, and that's a longer arc that does go back to the Enlightenment philosophers. And you know, one of the consequences of breaking up tradition to replace it with a more pleasurable society. It's not, again, it's not that I'm hostile to pleasure, or I don't succumb to it as much as anybody else. It's where it fits in the scheme of things. You know, a mother doesn't feed a child simply because of pleasure. You don't, love doesn't just always play out itself in pleasure. This is just a lie. And Freud is part of the lie. De Sade is the sort of more monstrous version of the lie, but intellectuals like him. So, you know, so I think that's what's really happened. So on the one hand, appetitive's unleashing a world in which everything around sexuality is all the walls and shades and are broken open, the transparency, everyone sees her. I am who I fuck, you know. This sorry, I fell at you, but you know, it's a worldview that is based upon a certain intense experience, or it can be, it might not be intense, but a potentially intense experience, which nevertheless is simply a passing experience. And in fact, the consequences of the experience can often be far more if someone gets pregnant, or if they have an abortion and then they regret having an abortion, or, you know, all of these things are what life is, to focus upon this. And then because, and here's another aspect to it that is central. So you can see, I see it's confluence, and that is rights talks. I've given a series of lectures, which I put online, called Insights and Oversights. And one of the recent ones, I think the most recent one I just put up, was about rights talk and what's wrong with it, and how rights talk morphs into right talk. You know, if you don't speak rightly, then you're not allowed to speak. So what had been a right gets overturned because of the push behind everything. But rights talk is it's not that there's never an appropriate and even valuable forum where that kind of speech actually says something and has a point, but to use it for all sorts of every aspect of what we are, to see that as the fulcrum of everything, as opposed to a particular phase and stage of social configuration, conflict resolution, etc., where you go, okay, that's stopped, this is my rights. Which, in the case of sexuality, let's say, that's stopped. You can't arrest me for having sex with someone who's of my gender. You can't do that anymore. This has been stopped, and it's been stopped in the courts. We put that aside. That fine. But when you have a society in which the whole momentum of its future is being built by appeal to rights, you know you're dealing with a lie, because it can't be. It has to be built. A society not only about yes, but they're also about no. They're also about sacrifice. In fact, all ancient peoples, and you know, our idiot elite love to talk about other traditions without actually ever talking about any other traditional things, because they don't know anything about other traditions. A bit like Margaret Mead's fantasy with the Polynesians, you know. They don't know any of these things. But other traditions, in fact, until the Enlightenment, I would say all societies, wherever you went, can be seen to be held together by sacrificial order. This, by the way, is what I think Girard gets wrong, if anyone's interested in René Girard. I think he underplays aspects of sacrifice that don't fit his theory, which are absolutely intrinsic to things, including the Christian faith, but not only the Christian faith, intrinsic to all social reproduction up until modern times, where it's still there, but it's just not talked about, it's not valorized, and it will be displaced by those people that will decide who has the right then to actually have a child, because everyone will be able to have sex, but not everyone will be able to have a child, because if we can be pleasured and infantile, and that's the end of our being and our thinking, that will suffice, according to this psychology.
And what's interesting with that, Wayne, is certainly the past couple of years, and I think observably for the past 10 years, there's been it's not just one agenda or one point, but clearly a certain line of thought has broken through. And part of that, I think, is the baby boomers are going off the scene, and they at least had enough of the fumes of Christianity that could maintain, even if they personally were not particularly devout or whatever.
Well, they had their parents. They had their parents.
They still, yes, exactly. And
but as parents themselves, less good.
Right. I mean, yeah, that was breaking down by the First World War and the Second, but there was still enough gasoline, there was still enough cultural fumes left. And what we're seeing now, as I observe things, is that that's evaporating, and that's bad. What's worse is there's nothing that's going to fill that we can see in the near future. There's no other sacrificial tradition that's going to fill that void, and so we're completely in the hands of the puppet masters on the wall. And part of this is, you mentioned, this aspect of regulation of birth and so forth. There's also been something else off on the margins, and that is genetic manipulation, something I've talked quite a bit about.
Absolutely. Which is part of this, of course.
Yes.
Because the elite will use our body. Everything is to be commodified.
Yes.
Everything is to be calculative. This is why I really, attack Marxism a lot, but it's not because I think everything is wrong. I think it's got a pseudo solution. But I think Heidegger too. I attack Heidegger a lot. But he's right. He's absolutely right about the metaphysical dominance of calculability within the modern. He's entirely right, and his histories on the lectures of philosophy are absolutely brilliant. In my book, I give Idolizing the Ideal. I point out where I think he's really missing really important stuff, but that stuff is absolutely right. So this elite, and they are so. If you go to Yale, or Harvard, you're not going to marry someone who fits tires down in Memphis, or I don't know, some place that no one's ever heard of. You're not going to marry them. You're going to marry your own. So the elite reproduces itself. It gets it does what it takes what it takes. It does what it does. And human bodies, they're always the first thing you think about. William Buckley. I mentioned this in the lecture series of Insights and Oversights at one point, but William Buckley was an Australian convict who lived amongst Aboriginal tribes for 30 years. And he observed that one of the biggest sources of conflict was women. They'd fight to get women. We know the rape of the Sabine women in the Roman tradition. We know that slavery, enslavement of women, women trafficking women is very, so sexuality is sexual desire is a big component. It's a big problem. It's a big source of violation. And, there's going to be, with this elite, sex workers, normalized everything as a profession. I'm not prudish about this, but I just see that what is happening is a free flow of sexuality. It is not about equality. It's bullshit. That this is its biggest Ponzi scheme con job. You're there. You there, so this is where the elite does break down. You saps in the police force and the school teachers and even the academics, you are saps in believing this. It's not about your sexuality. No one cares about that in our world. That problem is solved. What it is about a certain politicization of social formation in which there is a breakdown of division, in which the only people that can solve this are the technocracy, and they are going to be the ones who will decide which body parts they need, who can have children, how you'll be called out of what Heidegger calls the standing army of reserve, or the standing reserve, sorry, and Marx calls the reserve pool of the unemployed, because he argued in Das Kapital that unemployment was intrinsic to capitalism because there had to be that reserve pool. And I think that's kind of right. Not necessarily, I don't want to go too far into that, but there is something right about that, there will be, you'll be there, there'll be, that's why, universal income is part of it. And again, these saps and idiots that, I know someone, he's a nice guy, has written a book on how great it is, and it, not one problem. Again, that's Marx's problem. He never looked at one problem the system could have. You don't design a system if you don't consider all the problems that you at least are aware of, which of course means that's only going to be this many, because once you do something, all these problems you could never envisage occur. That's how we live life. It's one piece of shit after another, one problem after another. So that is what I think is the consequence of this, is that the complete calculability of every aspect, abortion, the material of abortion, a lot of people say a life, what was once a life, or a potential life, if we want to go all Aristotelian on which is it. But nevertheless, if you can't see there's something a bit disgusting about the complete materialization, even no matter what your take on abortion is, have you got no shame? That, have you got no reverence for spirit? The Catholic tradition, I think, is working with, whether people agree with it or not, but is working with a sense that there is a spirit of life, and the spirit of life may even precede the actual mechanical degree of formation, but we revere the spirit of life. Now, there's other, I'm not saying that solves the debate, because people will argue, and ultimately that is a political thing, and that's because I think politics is all we have to broker between irreconcilable positions, and then we just have to, and culture, of course, is over time you can work towards that, and that's the problem with us, of course. The culture's broken, it's being deliberately orchestrated. The breakage fuels the benefits of these, forgive my word, but scum. I do think they're horrible people. They have no sense of how shamelessly horrible. I see a Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, their conceit, their entitlement, it just, and I don't even like moral philosophy. It just, in my guts, I feel, no, these are terrible. And so many other people who I know, I think they're really nice people, but their brains have been eroded and corroded by accepting what is ultimately a lot of things to accept, but they're all around you, all normalized in the language. Way back in the beginning of modern metaphysics, which in many ways the modern project is a philosophical project. It's a moral project, a philosophical project. It's a displacement of the priestly powers by philosophical powers. We then talk about it as an ideological, But ideology is just, you know, the brainchild of not very good philosophy, but it's a brainchild out of that. So it's this emphasis upon clear and distinct ideas, going back to Descartes. But when they God, I hate that. I start off with something and I see 10 other points and I can't help addressing them. Yeah, back to the Enlightenment. What that is setting up is an appraisal of life in which we will oversee it, and through overseeing it we can manipulate it to be what it is we wish. But who is this we, of course? And that's the Nietzsche comes along and says, well, it's Superman. Marx comes along and says it's everybody, but he has no idea of how to make it everybody because it's a fantasy. Nietzsche, which is why we've got something closer to Nietzsche than Marx, but Marx was smarter than Nietzsche in terms, or the present generation who fuse the two without even realizing they're doing it are smarter because they make themselves a higher men and women by ultimately setting up a system of clientelism in which there's this dependency of which we need you to liberate us, and we will liberate you, and our liberation will be, and you will have a universal income. You'll have exactly what we think you need to have. God, I think I lost one of those points.
No, that's very very compact there, and you know, I wish, I don't know about if we had universal income. I wish we had universal clocks here. I'm afraid we're over an hour here. This was excellent, Wayne. This was excellent. Thank you so much.
I love it, John.
Absolutely. And Wayne, where can we find out about your work and your books and your music as well?
Okay, well, if you go, so music, I've done three things. And I have a very unsuccessful commercial career, which is to say I haven't made a cent from any music. And maybe people listen and say, well, no, I should just, so I've, on Spotify, the albums When the Night Does Fall, under my name, Wayne Quistordo. After 25 years, the Men of Shem present Red Room songs by Men of Shem. And Old Man Under the House, the album is called Blessings of My Days, and I've got, so there you can find them on Spotify. They are all on YouTube. The Old Man Under the House seems to be harder to find. I have put up a couple of video clips from that. That's my latest one. My books, I've got a lot of stuff in the postal. I've been writing there for almost 2 years on a regular basis. And I do the elite, you know, attacking the elite has become almost the thing I do regularly, because I keep, you know, one thing happens each day, you know, that just infuriates me, and I keep seeing it tying into certain things. So I worry that I have got a few philosophical pieces in there. Bits that were going to be in the second volume of the Idolizing the Idea. All my books can be found on Amazon, by the way, if you just want to check the titles. Yeah, what was I saying? What was it? I did, you know, I got up at about 4:30 this morning, not because of this. I could not sleep. So that might explain my
you were
brain
talking about chapters that were going to be in your book that might have been on the postal.
Oh yes, thank you. And so I was going to do a second volume. When I initially wrote the book, what happened is that I had conceived it as a kind of 3-volume work, and then I thought, well, let's just finish this volume. It started out as a critique, a kind of there's a guy called Peter Winch called Ideas of Social Science. It was really about thinking about how to organize one's thinking, you know, the material it has to think with, and the benefits and the pros and cons of philosophy and which philosophers. And it then became more chronological argument against the clear and distinct ideas stuff of the Cartesian tradition, and in some ways a some criticism, not completely, but some criticism of Platonic and ancient tradition. I'm very partial to the comparative method of Aristotle when it comes to politics. I think it's great. And so, and of course, Plato is brilliant in lots of ways, but with and so is Descartes. You know, it's not that they're brilliant, but you can be brilliant and miss something really important. And then I had sections on Vico, Harman, and Herder, which of course Cy Berlin wrote a little book on putting those three together. It was initially on two of them, and then he added a bit on Harman. I think he's quite good on Vico Berlin. I think he's not very good on Herder, and I think he's really not good at all on Harman. So that made me, and then I was going to do a second volume in which I was going to do on philosophical anthropology. After I completed the book and I saw no one is interested in this and no one is reading it, that sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I didn't know, and I thought, oh, the publisher insisted I cut 50,000 words before they'd publish it. And so I thought, and they were already being pretty generous for a publisher because it's 150,000 words long, and nowadays most books are like 80,000, 100,000. So I cut the last bit, which was basically, here's the good stuff. I've gone through, and apart from Thomas Reid, who's a kind of mini hero in this tale, apart from Thomas Reid, I have given you a discussion, a critical history of why they did what they did, some good things, but also why we can't stay with this. And then I wanted to say, and why the philosophical path opened by Vico, Harman, and Herder, each opens up a different aspect. In some ways, I think Herder is the great unsung genius of modern philosophy. I write quite a lot on Hegel and Schelling there, and Hegel, who in many ways is a great, but he has one big flaw. Whereas I don't see, I can't say Herder's got one big flaw. I don't see it that way. I say, you know, this has happened and that's happened. He's missed that. But I think it's magnificent. Herder, by the way, was the greatest influence upon Goethe. And poor old Herder had to, you know, witness, first of all, the philosophers ignoring him. That's what I wanted to say. Hegel doesn't even mention him in his lectures on the philosophy of history of philosophy. Doesn't even mention him. He does write on Harman, and I'm very fond of Harman. Hegel does, and it's actually very good and quite. But the problem he finds with Harman is there's no system, and that's the problem with. In some ways, Herder wants to do a system, but he's just too big. He's too curious. So I then put these three essays in the postal. So there's three essays on them, which the editor Nermal does, broke up into three parts, but they're really all of a piece, and they were meant to be the beginning of a work on philosophical anthropology, which I'm not sure I'll ever get around to writing it now. And like an idiot, I said when I was convinced there would be a second volume, and you know, I think there's been 2 reviews of the book. Hardly a successful academic career. And one of the reviewer does start off saying there's going to be a second volume because I say it. I thought, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. I really wish I hadn't said that. There you go in my face.
Well, we'll have the viewers here. They'll make it up. They'll knock it out the park, and you'll get those sales moving. So all of Wayne's links, the Amazon and to the Postal, they'll all be down below there for the audience here. And to the audience, thank you for joining us for this episode 141. And Wayne, especially, thank you so much for this very insightful discussion of current events, sociology, history, philosophy.
Well, thank you, John. I will sit down. Gee, you've been doing it a while, and maybe we can talk off camera for a moment. I'd just like to ask you a few things about that, though I'm happy to do it on camera, but I'm sure you won't.
All right, over and out.